All right, kia ora everybody. Over the weekend, New Zealanders have had a chance to understand the details, or some of the details, of the government's budget, and I think day by day as people get into that, they're understanding what a catastrophe it is for New Zealand as a whole, particularly for some of our most vulnerable New Zealanders, as we understand what's been cut, why it's been cut, and the consequences of that. We can see that this government's budget is absolutely taking our country backwards. If I think about those who were led to believe by the National Party that they would get access to cancer treatments that they're still waiting for, I think it shows how cruel the National Party were to make that promise and then not deliver on it. People were expecting those cancer drugs to be funded from the middle of this year. It's now clear they're not going to be. For some people, that literally is a matter of life and death. And I think that Christopher Luxon and Nicola Willis, who went up and down the country promising New Zealanders access to those cancer treatments during the election campaign, are simply cruel in making a promise and then not delivering on it. It's not a commitment they should have ever made in the first place, but having made it, they should have made sure they delivered on it. They haven't done that. Today we're here to look at the implications of other government budget changes. We've seen over $3 billion being taken out of climate change-related initiatives. Initiatives like insulating, heating, and making homes more energy efficient, stuff that Christopher Luxon calls dumb stuff, which actually for a lot of Kiwi families is so important. Things like making sure your power bills are lower can make such a huge difference to Kiwi families and leave them significantly better off than the $2 a week they might get in their tax cut would leave them better off. So I think that the fact that the government don't seem to have made the effort to understand the consequences of the cuts that they're making really shows how unfit to govern they are. We'll continue to keep fighting against that. We'll continue to highlight the areas that we think that they have gotten wrong. They are absolutely taking the country backwards.
So what's the impact of the cuts to the Warmer Kiwi Homes Programme, and who will that affect?
Well, by narrowing down what can be paid for by the Warmer Kiwi Homes Programme, what we've just heard here is that will mean that a lot of the households that haven't been reached already now won't be reached, because in many cases to insulate them there's some extra work that is required. The government have removed that extra work from the eligibility criteria, and that means that those homes just won't get insulated.
So how many hadn't been reached?
Well, it's hard to put a number on it. I think ECA will have more detailed numbers on exactly how many homes have not yet been insulated, but the easy homes to insulate have largely been reached, so it's the more complex ones that are not going to be reached now.
Targeted program, there was criteria.
Yes, there are criteria for it, but of course, providers like this work with fully paying customers as well, and then can use the profit from that to help reach those homes that are harder to reach.
Low-income families?
It'll be low-income families that miss out as a result of the cuts the government have made. Low-income families are missing out across the board from a lot of the cuts that this government have made. If we look at things like the cuts to the Warmer Kiwi Homes scheme, the fact that the tax cuts will often in some cases leave them worse off. 9,000 families, I think, at most recent count, are actually financially worse off because of the tax cuts, and it's low-income families that are being clobbered.
Just on cancer drugs, the Prime Minister has made a commitment to still meeting that promise that he made to cancer patients, and says he's going to make an announcement about that before the end of the year. Is that good enough?
They said by the 1st of July, and as I said, for the people who are awaiting that, it's a life and death situation for many of them. I don't think the National Party should have made that commitment. I think that, being that specific in terms of what drugs should and shouldn't be funded, I don't think politicians should be doing that in an election campaign. I think it's wrong because ultimately it leaves they do this in other countries, and then it becomes really ripe for the pharmaceutical lobby to get in, and the criteria for access to life-saving medications becomes more than just the scientific and medical criteria. It becomes political access and all of those sorts of things, and who can run the best PR campaign. I don't think they should have gone down that road, but having done that, to promise it and then not to deliver it is just cruel.
And the government's explanation about the Pharmac budget blowing out, Is that something that should have been foreseen?
It's just absolute nonsense. Look, it's very clear on a day-to-day basis now that the National Party, Nicola Willis in particular, was either too lazy or too incompetent to actually read the last budget. All of the things that she's claiming, like fiscal cliffs and so on, it was all there. It was all completely transparent, as it is now. Having railed against fiscal cliffs, that were time-limited funding initiatives that we put in place, she then has created more of them in this budget, which shows she's just completely hypocritical. There were no nasty surprises there. It was all transparent. In our budget, for example, our fiscal plan that we put before the election, before the last election, we had ongoing funding for things like the Food in Schools program and areas, and Pharmac as well. So, and the National Party in their fiscal plan had funding for Food in Schools and for Pharmac. So they knew that was something that a future government was going to have to make sure it funded. So this is just Nicola Willis not being able to make her numbers add up. Almost every economist in the country said to the National Party before the election, your numbers don't add up. And Nicola Willis and Christopher Luxon were the only ones in the country that thought they did. You'll have lots and lots of quotes from them saying, we know numbers. It turns out they don't.
Where do you think they could find this 250 million odd that they need for the 13 cancer drugs, and what could lose out as a result potentially?
There are an awful lot of things they could have funded if they hadn't given $2.9 billion worth of tax cuts to landlords. That was their first priority. And ultimately, is that flowing through to warmer, drier homes? No. Is it flowing through into lower rents? No. This is money that is not going to the people who need it the most. It's going to the people who need it the least.
What do you make of Anthony Albanese signalling possible changes to the 501 deportation policy?
I think we should monitor that closely. It's an area where there's some nuance, obviously. I think for people who were born in New Zealand who have moved to Australia as children and have lived their whole life in Australia, and then got into trouble and then find themselves deported to New Zealand, I think that's manifestly unjust. For a Kiwi who, as an adult, goes to Australia and commits a crime and gets deported back to New Zealand, I think we would have to say fair enough. Australia is well within its rights to do that. We would deport someone in similar circumstances. But if they've lived in New Zealand for more or less their whole life, I think deportation would be unjust, and that is what Australia were doing, and we've seen less of that, and I think that's been a good thing. So we'll monitor very closely any further changes they make there.
Have you seen the story around allegations that Manurewa Marae around issues of census?
I saw some headlines about it, but I haven't seen the detail of that yet.
Do you think that issues around there are now allegations that census information has been copied, and Stats has brought in an independent investigator? What do you make of that?
I think it's really important that Stats does get to the bottom of that. So if census data has been used inappropriately, that is something that Stats New Zealand should take very seriously. Filling in your census is a compulsory thing. Everybody has to do it. But part of the deal there is that your personal information is very jealously, your privacy is very jealously guarded. So if there's been a breach in that, then they do need to get to the bottom of how that happened and why it happened and what the data was used for, and make sure that it can never happen again.
And it should be an independent body looking at that?
Well, either Stats New Zealand, how Stats New Zealand deal with that is really up to them, but they need to make sure that it's a very rigorous and very credible review of whatever has happened.
Labor made some complaints last year around issues of treating there. Is that still a concern?
We certainly had some concerns at the election that we thought went beyond what was acceptable during an election campaign in terms of inducements to vote.
So would this be something that you would like to have looked at quite seriously?
Just the allegation alone is something that Stats New Zealand absolutely, even without all of the other things, is something that Stats New Zealand should absolutely take very seriously.
Mark Mitchell wants to review the legislation around car seizures. What do you think about that? Do you think it will make a difference?
It's more tough talk from Mark Mitchell that's not actually backed up by action. The reality here is that they always talk a tough game when it comes to things like boy races, but how many cars did they crush last time they changed the law? 1, 2 maybe? The reality here is it's more complicated than that, and Mark Mitchell might have to sit down and think really, really hard and try and come up with something that's actually going to make a difference rather than just more tough talk. Because as he's shown in the last 6 months, the tough talk doesn't actually change anything.
And so on the cancer drugs, my understanding was that the Cancer Control Agency did name those 13 drugs. So were they remiss in doing that as well?
We still have Pharmac as the final drug buying agency in a politically independent way for a very good reason, because otherwise you get to a situation, as they have in other countries, where the pharmaceutical companies with very, very deep pockets get very engaged in political lobbying, very engaged in election campaigns, and ultimately the choices around which drugs get funded is no longer based on medical science, but based on which drug companies are most effective at lobbying. I don't think we should go down that road.
So even it was inappropriate for the Cancer Control Agency to do that too?
Well, the Cancer Control Agency, we set it up, and we set it up with to be an advocate for cancer treatment and for those with cancer. But the final decisions around what drugs get funded should still be made by Pharmac.
Just again on that, the Prime Minister spoke this morning around that it's also an issue of procurement and making sure that once those decisions are made that they're able to get those drugs out there. So it's sort of a delay in terms of timing to make sure on the back end it works more efficiently.
Well, for someone who claims to be a commercial negotiating genius, Christopher Luxon seems to have missed a fairly obvious fact that when he named 13 drugs and said these are drugs we're going to fund, his bargaining power was somewhat diminished.
And on the Prime Minister and the budget last week, a number of cuts were made to Pacific funding. What do you make of the Prime Minister heading over to the Pacific today for his first official visit there?
I think it's good that he's going to the Pacific. I think it's important that New Zealand senior politicians do travel regularly to the Pacific. So I welcome the fact the Prime Minister's doing that. I only managed to make one trip in the brief 9 months that I was Prime Minister, but I would have certainly have liked to have done more. I think those relationships are really important. I do think the government undervalue the contribution of the Pacific community here in New Zealand. And again, the budget just highlights that. Very little in it for Pacific communities, and in terms of the cuts that are being made, Pacific communities will be disproportionately affected by those.
The $250 figure, that includes the daycare subsidy that some families will get, and then my understanding is they have to invoice and send it back to IRD. How much pressure do you think that really relieves?
Look, I think the reality here is the National Party were out and out dishonest when they were using the $250 a fortnight for an average family figure during the election campaign. It was never going to be that. Very, very few families would ever qualify for that full amount. And the National Party were never clear about that during the election campaign. They managed to sort of dodge questions about that during the election campaign, and I think they were dishonest in the way they presented that to the public. The childcare subsidy is going to be a nightmare for families to claim, and my prediction is that only a fraction of the families that could theoretically be eligible will actually get the subsidy that the National Party's promised them, because again it's another situation where you have to tick a lot of boxes to get the maximum subsidy that the National Party talks about. They talk about the maximum subsidy all of the time, and actually very few families will qualify for that. One of the very first example in their tax flyer, for example, suggested that a family with one income earner with 60,000 and another with 50,000, two children in early childhood education and two other children, you'd be talking about a handful of families across the whole country that would be in that category. So I just think they've gone big on the spin. And pretty light on the substance.
Do you think New Zealanders are seeing through that, or do you think people are seeing that they're going to get a tax cut in there?
I think there's a lot of New Zealanders who are gutted by this budget because they had high expectations as a result of the big, big promises Christopher Luxon and Nicola Willis made them that they haven't delivered on.
The National Party would say that they were always accurate or technically correct, and there is always electioneering during a campaign. I'm sure you have done a little bit of that.
The promise was pretty clear. It was $250 a fortnight for an average income family with a couple of kids. That's not what they're getting. Cool. Thanks everybody.